In recent years, a phrase has sparked intense debate in boardrooms, churches, and political chambers across the Western world. A phrase so divisive that even devoted religious leaders have begun to question its implications. That phrase is Christian nationalism. But here's what most people don't realize: this isn't a new idea. It's a centuries-old concept that has resurfaced at a moment when the relationship between faith and politics has become more complicated than ever. Today, we're uncovering what religious leaders truly fear about this movement, and why nations worldwide are paying very close attention. Hello, and welcome back to Soulway. I'm your host, and if you're new to our channel, I'm so glad you're here. We explore the intersections of faith, history, and society with thoughtfulness and nuance. Before we dive deep into today's topic, I want to ask you something. How do you understand the relationship between faith and nationalism? Should they be intertwined or should they remain separate? It's a question that's dividing scholars, theologians, and political figures right now. If these kinds of thought-provoking questions resonate with you, please hit that subscribe button. And if you value balanced, respectful explorations of complex topics, the bell icon will notify you whenever we upload. Your support helps us continue creating content that makes you think. Now, let's begin our journey into one of the most misunderstood movements of our time. Before we can truly understand why this movement concerns so many leaders, we need to know what it actually is. And this is where it gets interesting, because Christian nationalism isn't a single, unified ideology. Instead, it's a collection of beliefs that blend Christian identity with national identity. At its core, Christian nationalism asserts that a particular nation, predominantly speaking about Western nations like the United States, was founded upon Christian principles, and that those Christian values should be central to its governance, laws, and culture. Sounds perhaps reasonable on the surface, but let's examine this more carefully. Of most Western nations reveals something rather different. The United States Constitution, for instance, contains no reference to God, Jesus, or Christianity. In fact, the framers deliberately avoided establishing any state. Religion. The separation of church and state wasn't anti-religious. It was designed to protect both religion and government. Yet Christian nationalists often cite earlier historical moments, cultural traditions, and the personal faith of individual founders to argue that a Christian foundation exists. This creates an immediate tension. Which version of history are we reading? What's your perspective? Do you think nations have inherent religious foundations? Comment your thoughts below. Think about it this way. If we were going to claim a nation was founded on particular values, we need to be precise about which parts of history we're emphasizing and which we're downplaying. And that's where the scholarly debate becomes heated. To understand why Christian nationalism is rising now, we must understand its past. And the history here is far more complex than most people realize. The relationship between Christianity and nationalism isn't new. In fact, it stretches back to medieval Europe, where the church and crown were so intertwined that separating them was almost unimaginable. Kings claimed divine authority. The church legitimized royal rule. It was a partnership born from necessity and maintained through mutual benefit. But something shifted during the Enlightenment. New ideas about individual rights, secular governance, and the separation of religious and civil authority began circulating among philosophers and thinkers. This created what historians call cognitive dissonance among Christian communities. How could faith remain central to society if government operated on secular principles? Historical context. Different Christian communities responded in different ways. Some embraced the secular framework, believing that faith could thrive independently. Others resisted fiercely, arguing that removing Christian influence from public life would lead to moral decay. This resistance didn't disappear, it evolved. By the 19th and 20th centuries, especially in America, a particular brand of Christian nationalism emerged. It emphasized that American exceptionalism was intertwined with Christian virtue. America wasn't just a nation. It was seen by some as a city on a hill, a biblical reference suggesting divine purpose. Now, here's the crucial insight. Many mainstream Christian leaders at that time rejected this framing. They argued that Christianity's mission transcended national boundaries, and that nationalism, the elevation of one nation above others, contradicted core Christian teachings about universal brotherhood and love for strangers. This raises a profound question. Can nationalism and universal faith coexist, or are they fundamentally at odds? Think about that. and share your thoughts in the comments. Why religious leaders are concerned. This brings us to one of the most fascinating developments in recent years: the alarming concerns raised by mainstream religious leaders themselves. Over the past decade, prominent Christian scholars, theologians, and church leaders have begun publicly opposing Christian nationalism. And their concerns are substantive, not merely political. First concern: theological distortion. Many religious leaders argue that Christian nationalism misrepresents Christian theology. Christianity, in its traditional understanding, emphasizes submission to divine will over loyalty to earthly powers. When nationalism becomes the priority and Christian faith becomes its tool, something sacred gets inverted. Faith serves the state, rather than transcending it. One prominent theologian noted that Christian nationalism often requires believers to equate loyalty to a particular nation with loyalty to God, something that many Christian traditions teach is a form of idolatry. Now consider the weight of that charge. These are experts in Christian thought saying that this movement contradicts fundamental Christian doctrine. Second concern: historical revisionism. Religious leaders worry that Christian nationalism requires rewriting history. It demands selecting certain historical facts while ignoring others. When you do this systematically, you distort not only history but also the foundation upon which people's understanding rests. For example, American Christian nationalism often emphasizes the religious faith of some founders while remaining silent about slavery, the displacement of indigenous peoples, and the religious diversity among those same founders. It's selective storytelling presented as comprehensive history. Here's what might surprise you. Many of the most vocal critics of Christian nationalism are deeply committed Christians themselves. These aren't secular opponents attacking faith. They're faith leaders alarmed that faith is being weaponized for political purposes. Third concern: social division and exclusion. When you define a nation as inherently Christian, what happens to citizens of other faiths, or those of no faith? They become implicitly or explicitly others in their own homeland. Church leaders recognize this has real consequences. It can fuel discrimination, marginalize minority communities, and contradict the religious principle of equal human dignity. Some Christian leaders have stated explicitly that Christian nationalism violates the core Christian command to love one's neighbor, especially the stranger and the vulnerable. Now I want to ask you, can you maintain deep religious conviction while also fully embracing citizens of different faiths or no faith as complete equals? These aren't easy questions, but they're essential ones. What's your perspective? Fourth concern: political exploitation. Perhaps the most troubling concern among religious leaders is that Christian nationalism often becomes a tool for politicians seeking religious legitimacy. When a political agenda gets framed as a Christian agenda, it becomes harder to question. It gains a sacred aura. Political disagreements become religious battles. This, many leaders argue, corrupts both politics and religion simultaneously. Beyond theological concerns, political leaders of various ideological stripes are worried about the practical implications of rising Christian nationalism. In several Western democracies, political parties and movements have begun explicitly connecting themselves to Christian national identity. The stated goal, they say, is protecting Christian values in society. But critics worry this is reshaping democracy itself. The concern for democratic pluralism. Modern democracies are built on the premise that no single religious or ideological group dominates policymaking at the expense of others. When Christian nationalism gains political power, it threatens this balance. Laws can begin reflecting sectarian interests rather than universal principles. Education becomes contested. Science policy becomes influenced by particular theological commitments. Historical parallels. Some scholars have drawn uncomfortable comparisons to earlier periods in history when particular religious groups gained disproportionate political power. Not to suggest all instances are identical, context matters profoundly. But the pattern concerns historians. When religious identity becomes fused with national identity and political power, minorities become vulnerable. The international dimension. Nations with rising Christian nationalism have begun reshaping foreign policy through this lens. Support for certain international conflicts becomes framed as supporting Christian interests. International organizations are scrutinized through a sectarian lens. This has real consequences for global diplomacy and stability. Here's something fascinating. International observers, including leaders from secular nations and from nations with different religious majorities, are watching this closely. They recognize that if Christian nationalism reshapes policy in major Western nations, it will influence global affairs. This isn't merely an internal matter anymore. If a nation's foreign policy becomes influenced by the religious identity of its majority population, is that a problem? Or is that inevitable and acceptable? These are the questions policy leaders are wrestling with right now. What do you think? Now, before we conclude, it's essential to acknowledge something important. This issue isn't entirely one-sided. There are sincere people who support the ideas associated with Christian nationalism for reasons worth understanding, even if you disagree. Some genuinely believe that Christian principles have been foundational to Western concepts of human rights, democracy, and individual liberty. They point out that many pioneers of democracy and abolition were motivated by Christian faith. From their perspective, acknowledging this historical reality isn't nationalism, it's honesty. Others worry that secular governance, taken to extremes, can become hostile to religious expression and practice. They see Christian nationalism, in part, as a response to perceived marginalization of Christian voices in public discourse. These concerns deserve respectful consideration. The conversation shouldn't be about dismissing everyone who sees value in Christian cultural heritage or who wants faith to influence morality in public life. Many people hold these views without embracing the more troubling aspects of explicit Christian nationalism. However, and this is significant, most scholars distinguish between these legitimate concerns and the ideology of Christian nationalism proper. One can value Christian heritage and want faith to inform personal ethics, without believing that government should privilege Christian identity or that the nation has a sacred, divinely ordained Christian character. This complexity is where thoughtful people often disagree. Can you value your faith's historical contributions to civilization while also maintaining secular, pluralistic governance? Can those values coexist, or are they fundamentally in tense ion? I'd genuinely love to hear your perspective in the comments below. So where do we land after this journey through history, theology, and politics? Christian nationalism is rising in several Western democracies. Religious leaders are concerned not because they're anti-Christian, but because they believe faith is being distorted and wielded for political ends. Political leaders worry about threats to democratic pluralism. International observers are watching to see how this reshapes global affairs. But here's the deeper truth. The questions underlying this issue are timeless. How do we honor the values and history that shaped our societies? How do we maintain religious freedom and respect for all faiths simultaneously? How do we distinguish between legitimate cultural identity and ideological nationalism? These aren't easy questions, and they deserve more than slogans or dismissal. The invitation before us collectively is clear. We must learn to discuss faith, history, and politics with nuance, respect, and intellectual honesty. We cannot ignore how these forces interact, but we also cannot reduce complex realities to simplistic narratives. If this exploration has sparked thoughts, questions, or disagreements, I want to hear from you. Comment below respectfully and thoughtfully about what you think. And if you found value in this balanced, in-depth approach to complex topics, please subscribe to Soulway. We're committed to exploring these intersections with depth, respect, and intellectual seriousness. I'm your host, and this is Soulway. We'll see you in the next video.